You've probably heard the story. In 1946, the United States government supposedly sold surplus bomb shelters to desperate veterans for $295 and turned Cold War bunkers into starter homes for the men who'd just won the war. It's a great story. It's dramatic, it's strange, and it's almost true. But the real version is stranger, and it's been sitting in newspaper archives and government auction records for 80 years, waiting for someone to actually look. Because what the government really sold wasn't a bomb shelter at all. It was something the Navy built by the 100,000, something shaped like a tin can cut in half, something that had already survived typhoons in the Pacific and mud in the Aleutians. And in the summer of 1946, it became the only thing standing between a generation of American veterans and a life spent sleeping in their cars. This is the story of the Quonset hut, the housing crisis that made it a legend, and the sale at a place called Postwar, where 1,000 men lined up, some of them overnight, for the chance to buy a home made of curved steel. To understand why a corrugated steel tube became the most desperate real estate purchase in American history, you have to understand what the country looked like in the months after the war ended. 16 million Americans had served in uniform. By the end of 1946, most of them were home. They came back to a country that had spent 4 years building tanks, not houses. Residential construction had almost completely stopped during the war. Materials, labor, and factories had all been redirected to the war effort, and for 4 straight years, almost nobody built a new home. Now, all at once, 16 million veterans wanted somewhere to live. Many of them wanted to get married. Many of them already had. The country was about to enter the greatest baby boom in its history, and there was, in the plainest sense of the word, nowhere to put anyone. Government estimates in early 1946 put the shortfall at 3.5 million homes needed that year alone. 3.5 million. Not eventually. That year. In St. Louis, nearly 900,000 people were crowded into a city where residential space was 99% occupied. In New York, a newlywed couple set up housekeeping in a department store window, hoping the publicity would shame someone into finding them an apartment. In Omaha, a newspaper classified ad suggested a 7 by 17-foot icebox could be, in the words of the ad, fixed up to live in. Families doubled and tripled up in relative spare rooms. Veterans slept above garages. Some slept in their cars, in parking lots, within sight of jobs they had just been hired for. This wasn't a housing shortage in the abstract economic sense. This was a 5-alarm national emergency, and it was happening to the very men the country had just spent 4 years calling heroes. The men who had won the war were coming home to discover there was nowhere left for them to live. While cities scrambled and Congress argued, one very specific object was quietly sitting in warehouses and depots by the hundreds of thousands, and almost nobody outside the military had thought about it as a house. The Quonset hut had been developed by the Navy in 1941, engineered at a base called Quonset Point in Rhode Island, which is where it got its name. The design was almost embarrassingly simple, a semicircular arch of corrugated galvanized steel, prefabricated in sections, bolted together over a wooden frame, capable of being erected by a small crew in a matter of hours with no cranes and no concrete foundation required. It could be shipped flat, stacked like sheet metal, and assembled almost anywhere on Earth. And that is exactly what the military did with it. Quonset huts went up on Pacific atolls under fire. They went up in North Africa, in the mud of Europe, on the tundra of the Aleutian Islands. By the end of the war, somewhere between 150,000 and 170,000 of them had been manufactured, more than any other prefabricated military structure in American history. They had housed troops, stored ammunition, served as field hospitals, and mess halls and machine shops. They were never designed to be beautiful. They were designed to survive and to be thrown up fast, and by 1945 there were tens of thousands of them the military simply did not need anymore. But nobody had planned for what would happen when a nation desperate for homes collided with a warehouse full of buildings nobody wanted. Behind the scenes, this wasn't a simple or uncontested decision. The War Assets Administration was under enormous pressure from multiple directions at once. Storing hundreds of thousands of surplus structures cost money. The government didn't want to keep spending, and every month of delay meant more warehousing fees, more depreciation, and more political pressure from a public that could see, with its own eyes, that veterans were sleeping in cars while military bases sat full of unused buildings. There were arguments for simply scrapping the huts entirely and selling the raw steel for its metal value, which in the short term might have been more profitable. There were arguments for donating them outright to municipalities rather than selling them, which cities themselves lobbied hard for, since a free hut was obviously more attractive than a $200 one. And there were arguments from steel manufacturers like Great Lakes Steel Corporation in favor of protecting the emerging civilian prefabricated housing market, since a flood of dirt-cheap government surplus threatened to undercut the very same private manufacturers who were gearing up to build new huts for profit. In the end, the compromise that emerged was the one history remembers. Modest, below-market prices, sold directly to veterans first, with priority certificates ensuring the men who had actually served got first access before the general public or private resellers could scoop up the inventory. It wasn't charity, and it wasn't a giveaway. It was a calculated, if improvised, answer to a crisis nobody in Washington had fully anticipated just a year earlier. The agency responsible for untangling that collision was called the War Assets Administration, the federal body tasked with liquidating the staggering mountain of surplus equipment the war had left behind. Tanks, jeeps, aircraft, ammunition, uniforms, and yes, tens of thousands of Quonset huts all needed to be sold, scrapped, or given away, and fast, before storage costs bankrupted the effort of cleaning up after the war itself. Somewhere inside that agency, someone connected two numbers that should have been obvious from the start. 3.5 million homes needed, and a warehouse full of steel arches nobody in uniform wanted anymore. The Quonset hut wasn't glamorous. It wasn't what anyone had imagined when they pictured coming home from the war to start a family. But it was fast, it was cheap, and critically, it already existed. In July of 1946, the War Assets Administration organized one of the largest sales of its kind at Port Hueneme, a naval base in California that had been a hub of Quonset hut construction throughout the war. The offer was 811 Quonset huts, sold directly to World War II veterans, priced by size and by the number of windows installed, ranging from roughly $230 up to around $295. To a veteran who had spent years sleeping in a foxhole and had come home to a housing market that offered him nothing, that price sounded less like a bargain and more like a miracle. More than 1,000 veterans showed up. Some of them camped outside the gates the night before, just to make sure they'd get first pick. Picture it, a dusty naval yard in Southern California, in the middle of July, lined with men still carrying the posture of soldiers, some in uniform, some not, waiting for a chance to buy a half-cylinder of curved steel and call it home. By the end of the first day, 75% of the 811 huts had already been claimed, snapped up by roughly 600 veterans who understood exactly what they were looking at. This wasn't charity, it wasn't glamorous, it was a chance, and after years of war, a chance was worth waiting outside a gate overnight for. Newspapers covering the sale described a scene that felt almost like a gold rush. Men compared notes on which huts had the most windows, since window count directly determined price, and a hut with more glass meant a warmer, brighter home for a young family. Priority certificates, issued to veterans ahead of the general public, decided who got first pick, and men who had spent years following orders in the military now found themselves following an entirely different kind of chain of command, this one dictated by a clipboard and a line number. Alongside the huts, the same surplus sale offered tentage, steel bunks, electrical saws, bridge building equipment, water pumps, and in a detail that still reads as faintly absurd today, at least one air raid warning siren, all being sold off in the same yard, on the same afternoon, to the same desperate crowd. It's easy to imagine how, decades later, someone flipping through old photographs of that sale, seeing steel structures and air raid equipment sold side by side, might start to blur the line between what was military surplus and what was meant to survive an attack. The myth didn't come from nowhere. It came from a real photograph of a real crowd standing next to equipment that genuinely did include an air raid siren, buying a home that just happened to be shaped like something built for war. What happened next is the part almost nobody remembers, and it's the part that makes this story so much stranger than any bomb shelter myth ever could. Buying the hut, it turned out, was only the beginning of the ordeal. Each Quonset hut weighed roughly 6 tons. The government sold you the structure. It did not deliver it to your front door. Veterans had to arrange to have their new home shipped, disassembled by rail, at a cost of 32 cents per £100, unless they were resourceful enough to pool their purchase with 5 other veterans, which cut the shipping rate to just over 10 cents per £100. So picture the scene that followed the sale itself. Groups of former soldiers, men who had coordinated amphibious landings and supply convoys under fire, now coordinating railcar shipments of prefabricated steel housing, splitting freight costs 6 ways, hauling curved sheet metal panels to empty lots where, piece by piece, bolt by bolt, they built their own homes with their own hands. Local governments got in on it too. In 1946, the city and county of Los Angeles each received 1,500 surplus Quonset huts to help house returning veterans. In Whittier, California, huts were erected specifically for veterans attending Whittier College, with entire villages of paired huts creating room for dozens of families almost overnight. At Western Kentucky State College, the university president built what became known as Veterans Village out of a patchwork of surplus Quonset huts, trailers, and prefabricated housing, and it remained in use, housing married students for the next 30 years. In La Crosse, Wisconsin, the city petitioned the federal government to hand over ordnance buildings for emergency housing entirely, and it wasn't just Quonset huts absorbing the shock. In Chicago, 250 retired trolley cars were converted into makeshift homes. In North Dakota, empty grain bins became apartments. In Atlanta, the city purchased 100 surplus trailers just to have somewhere to put returning soldiers and their new families. The country, in the most literal sense possible, was building a housing solution out of whatever it had left over from the war. The Quonset hut itself became something of a public relations project. The word hut was quietly dropped from a lot of marketing material around this time, likely because it carried the whiff of wartime austerity, of foxholes and mess tents, not exactly the image a young couple wanted attached to their first home. The Great Lakes Steel Corporation, the largest wartime manufacturer of the structures, pivoted hard into the civilian market, producing new versions marketed simply as prefabricated homes, stripped of their military branding. Architecture magazines of the era actually embraced the aesthetic, with Arts and Architecture urging homeowners to keep the form simple, to avoid dormers and orthodox roofs and, in their words, unrelated forms, essentially asking Americans to lean into the shape rather than disguise it. For a brief window in American history, the curved steel arch that had sheltered Marines on Pacific Islands became a legitimate, if unglamorous, symbol of the post-war American dream. And for thousands of families, it worked exactly as intended. It just didn't last. Because here's the twist almost nobody talks about. The Quonset hut, for all its ingenuity, was never actually meant to be a permanent home, and by 1950 the honeymoon was largely over. Veterans who had once lined up overnight to buy one now found themselves eager to leave it behind. The structures were small, oddly shaped, difficult to divide into normal rooms, and for many veterans, uncomfortably reminiscent of the barracks and Quonset camps they'd just spent years trying to escape. In Whittier, the huts began disappearing by 1950, as their occupants moved into conventional houses built in the booming new subdivisions of East and West Whittier. Cities that had once begged the government for huts were now scrambling to sell them off, tear them down, or repurpose them into something else entirely. And that repurposing turned out to be one of the strangest afterlives of any surplus structure from the entire war. Quonset huts that had once housed veteran families became diners. They became auto repair shops. They became barns for hay storage, grain silos, livestock shelters, small town churches, Sunday school rooms, university dormitories, and roadside retail stores. Some sat quietly on farms for decades, filled with tools and machinery, their occupants having long since forgotten they were once considered someone's first home. A handful still stand today, weathered, rusted, converted a dozen times over, tucked behind farmhouses and off rural highways, monuments to a housing crisis most Americans have completely forgotten. Which brings us back to that title. Bomb shelters sold for $295 to desperate veterans in 1946. It's not quite right, but it's not entirely wrong either, and that's exactly why the myth survives. The price is real. $295 really was the top end of what the government charged for a fully outfitted Quonset hut at that WWII sale in July of 1946. The desperation was real. The veterans really did camp outside a government sale overnight in the middle of a genuine national housing catastrophe. What got lost somewhere along the way, passed from one retelling to the next, is the specific shape of the object itself. A Quonset hut and a bomb shelter aren't the same thing, but they share a kind of visual DNA. Both are curved. Both are made of steel. Both look, at a glance, like something built to survive an attack rather than to raise a family in. Somewhere over 80 years of retelling, the low-arched military surplus housing of 1946 quietly transformed, in the public imagination, into something more dramatic, more Cold War, more bunker than barracks. The true story doesn't need the embellishment. A steel tube built for Pacific combat zones, sold for less than $300, assembled by hand by men who had just spent years assembling far deadlier things, is already one of the strangest and most human stories to come out of the entire post-war surplus liquidation. It didn't need a bomb shelter. It needed a family, a shipping manifest, and a Saturday afternoon with a wrench. The legacy of that summer at WWII runs deeper than most people realize. The GI Bill, passed in 1944, gets most of the credit for post-war American homeownership, and it deserves plenty of it, eliminating down payments and guaranteeing veteran mortgages on homes that by government mandate couldn't cost more than $10,000. But before the GI Bill's mortgage guarantees fully kicked in, before the tract housing developments of the late 1940s and early 1950s reshaped the American suburb, it was steel arches and trolley cars and grain bins that got a desperate generation through the gap. The private housing boom that followed was staggering by comparison. Housing starts rose by a factor of 20 from their wartime lows, climbing toward 1.7 million homes started in 1950 alone, a construction boom that fundamentally rebuilt how and where American families lived for the rest of the century. The prefabrication techniques pioneered by necessity in Quonset hut manufacturing, the idea that a home could be engineered in standardized parts and assembled on site by ordinary people rather than skilled craftsmen, quietly influenced the modular and prefabricated housing industries that still exist today. A handful of Quonset huts have even become minor historic curiosities, preserved by collectors and small museums as physical artifacts of a housing crisis this country has almost entirely forgotten it ever survived, So the next time you hear that the government sold bomb shelters to veterans for $295, you'll know the real answer, and honestly, it's better. It wasn't a bunker built to survive a nuclear strike. It was a half-cylinder of curved steel that had already survived a world war, handed to the men who fought it, at a price low enough that desperation alone could afford it. It was assembled by hand, in backyards and empty lots, by veterans who split freight costs with strangers and became neighbors in the process. It housed newlyweds and college students and church congregations, and then, just as quietly as it had appeared, it faded into barns and diners and forgotten corners of the American landscape. If you find one still standing today, rusted, repurposed, half hidden behind a farmhouse somewhere, you're not looking at a Cold War relic. You're looking at the first home an entire generation of American veterans could actually afford. What do you think? Would you have camped outside that gate at Port Hueneme for a chance at one? Let me know in the comments, and if you want more forgotten stories of what really happened to America's World War II surplus, subscribe, because the next one might be even stranger than this.